Greetings from Serbia and welcome to another episode of NT Podcast where science, theology, and philosophy meet. My name is Nemanja Jurišić, and today we are honored for the second time to be joined by one of the most respected philosophers of religion in the world, Professor Graham Oppy. Welcome, how are you?
Thanks for inviting me. I'm feeling just fine.
Thank you very much for coming. It's 2 a.m. in my place, so it's very interesting, but we will enjoy to the end. So let me just read for those who don't know you maybe. Dr. Oppy is professor of philosophy at Monash University, a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities, the founding editor of the Australasian Philosophical Review. He holds a PhD from Princeton, and he has made major contributions to debates on the existence of God, metaphysics, and rationality of belief. In this conversation, we will dive into one of the most fundamental philosophical questions. Is theism a coherent concept? Does the idea of God involve any internal contradictions? What are the logical challenges associated with divine attributes like omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection? To begin with, Dr. Oppy, is theism a coherent concept? Does theism contain any internal logical inconsistencies or contradictions?
Okay, so a decade or so ago, I wrote a book called Describing Gods. And in that book, it was a book about divine attributes. And so I think about the attributes one by one, and also think about them when you put them together. So there are people who think that some of the divine attributes just considered separately are somehow incoherent. There are people who think that when you put some of them together, you end up with incoherence. I argued in that book that no one had successfully shown that any of the divine attributes is incoherent, and no one's successfully shown that they're jointly incoherent. I suppose that you could, the future's always uncertain. Probably it will be slightly risky to say we know for sure that they're coherent, right, one by one and jointly. But I wouldn't bet on anyone being able to produce a demonstration that any of the attributes is incoherent on its own, or that any set of them are incoherent. That doesn't mean that people don't have incoherent conceptions of the attributes, or that they don't have incoherent conceptions of God. What I'm thinking about is the kind of best formulations that you can make, and sort of paying serious attention to what the best theistic philosophers and theologians say about these concepts.
Very interesting. So if you had to construct a version of theism that, in your view, comes closest to coherence, what would it look like?
So I think there are probably a range of different views that are coherent. And there are questions, hard questions to ask about all of them, but there are hard questions to ask about all worldviews, right? I mean, there are topics here. So one of the topics that you mentioned, I can't remember whether it was before we came on or in your introduction, about freedom. Well, it's very hard to know what to say about the debate about whether we have some kind of free will or not. And it matters how you answer that question, what you think you can say about divine freedom. Right. So there are definitely wider philosophical questions that are going to be relevant. Okay, put that one to one side. The kinds of theists that I interact with most have a range of very different views about God. So for Catholics who follow Thomas, there are certain things that we know about God through God's effects, but we actually don't really know anything about God's nature. And we can only sort of talk in an analogical way about God's properties. Right, so that's one kind of view. It's not very committal on what the attributes of God really are. In fact, I mean, there's another part of this, the divine simplicity, which in a way kind of denies that there are any attributes at all, right? There's just one attribute and that's identical to God. And then it's not clear then whether when we're saying that it's an attribute that we're doing anything other than talking in a kind of analogical way there too, right? So it's all, so that's one kind of view. Different kind of view, which you get amongst various Protestant philosophers of religion in the United States and elsewhere, is that we can say quite a bit about what the divine attributes are, because we start off with the idea that God's perfect or God's maximal in various respects, and then we can say what the relevant perfections are. So God has perfect knowledge, perfect power, perfect goodness, or God has maximal power, maximal knowledge, maximal goodness, and so on. And then we can, so there's those kinds of views. Then there are views that retreat from that a bit. So views, for example, which say that there are some respects in which God's maximal or perfect and other respects in which God isn't. So there are people who think, so open theists think this way, God doesn't have perfect knowledge or maximal knowledge. God learns stuff over time. And I think that has consequences for what you're going to say about the other attributes. I suspect, although open theists didn't typically say this, that if you're going to say that God isn't omniscient, you better say God's not omnipotent either, because for the following reason, that if God were omnipotent, God would be able to answer every question correctly, and so God would be omniscient. So if you're not omniscient, you're not omnipotent either. And so you get a kind of retrenchment from a lot of the standard attributes. Maybe if you're an open theist, you stick with God's perfectly good, but you've moved away from some of the others. And so if there are problems about saying that God knows everything or that God can do anything, however we're going to unpack omnipotence or omniscience, they won't affect open theism, because open theism isn't committed to those claims. Then one last claim, I mean, there are others, but a fourth thing to put on the table will be the kind of view that Eugen Nagasawa has, where he says the right way to think about God is that God's maximal, but God has these various attributes, power, knowledge, goodness, and so on, to the maximal extent on which it's consistent to attribute all of them to God. So it might be that there are problems about saying that God's, to take one example, I mean, all the examples are controversial, but to take one, there's a problem about saying that God's both omnipotent and perfectly good, because presumably if you're perfectly good, you can't do evil things, which means there are things you can't do, so you're not omnipotent. On Nagasawa's view, that's just not going to be a problem, because we only have to have the power and the goodness and the and wisdom and all the other attributes to the maximum possible, coherent extent, right? And so that makes it look as though lots of the problems about the coherence of theism are going to go away on that view. Okay, so there's a range, 3 or 4 different types of conceptions of God, and there are different questions that come up for all of them.
Amazing. So out of those 4, which one is the best according to your opinion?
So it's not that I have a favorite amongst the views. So I can see there are kind of, just from talking to theists about this, that there are attractions and things that you might not find attractive about each of the views. So For example, you find lots of people who favour the kind of perfection, omni attributes view, think that God's a person, right? So God has knowledge in the sense that we do, is good in the kind of sense that we are, has power in the kind of sense that we do. Find the Thomistic doctrine of divine simplicity, they will say, incoherent. So Plantinga wrote a book, Does God Have a Nature?, in which he argues that the Thomistic conception of divine simplicity is simply incoherent. Right. So there are internal disputes between theists about the coherence of the various views. I don't have an awe in that debate, right? I'm not interested in joining forces with some theists to argue against the coherence of the position of other theists.
All right, thank you so much. So let's start with the definitions first, then I will ask questions about that. Can you define at the beginning what is even omnipotence? Because many people will disagree.
Yeah, indeed. So there was a time when, and I kind of adverted to this already, when the way that many people thought about omnipotence amongst professional philosophers was that an omnipotent being can do anything, right? Or let me modify it a little bit, anything that it's possible for some being to do. Well, maybe that's not quite right either, but it can't be just God can do anything that is possible for God to do, because rocks can do anything that is possible for rocks to do, and they're not omnipotent, right? So that one, right? So there are problems with the formulation if you put it that way in terms of the possibility of being able to do things. There's a different way of thinking about it in terms of the powers that God has. So God's maximally powerful. One way of thinking about that is that God has and exercises power over everything else. And that's really, when we're talking about omnipotence, that's what we should be talking about. Other people have called this almightiness or something along those lines. And if you think about it that way, you're not going to get into questions like the paradox of the stone. Right, so I'll briefly explain that now, because this was a standard objection to the idea that God's omnipotent. Can God make a stone so heavy that God can't lift it? If he can't, then there's something that he can't do, right? And so he's right. On the other hand, if he can, then and he does, then there'll be something that he can't do, right? So either way, it looks as though God can't be necessarily omnipotent. And so that was thought to be a challenge to the coherence of the notion of omnipotence. There are ways of trying to just refine the abilities definition to get around this. The definitions quickly become very elaborate, and as it often happens in philosophy, there's this, people put up definitions, people come up with counterexamples, the definitions get modified, people come up with more counterexamples. But this happened in particular for omnipotence through the late 70s, through the 80s and into the 90s. There was a lot of this, and the definitions ended up getting quite complicated. I guess my own preference, I'm not sure that any of the patched versions of the abilities definition are fully satisfying, but I think that if you go with the kind of powers view, the almightiness view, it's not clear that you're going to end up with anything that's kind of incoherent.
All right, just this side question. If something is logically impossible, does it follow that it is also metaphysically impossible? And what about opposite case? So can you just define that?
Okay, so I'm going to think that there are difficulties with defining both. For logical impossibility, if we take it strictly, the idea is that we've got logical inconsistency. There's still a question about what the logic is, right? There are many logics, and there are things that will be deemed inconsistent in some logics and not in others. Now, one way to deal with this is to just say, okay, we're talking about classical predicate calculus, perhaps with extensions for if we have modality or time or something else, we add in some extra operators, but the kind of basic logic is classical predicate calculus. That doesn't satisfy everybody. There are contemporary philosophers of religion, so I'm thinking of somebody like J.C. Beale, who think that we should take the base logic to be paraconsistent logic rather than classical logic. Right. So right at the beginning, there's kind of some tricky foundational questions about exactly what you mean by or logical impossibility. But let's suppose, and maybe to make our discussion easier, let's pretend that we're just talking about classical logic. What do we mean by metaphysical possibility? What's a metaphysical modality in opposition to this logical modality? I should have said one other thing about the logical modality. There's another question about whether, for example, you think that all bachelors are unmarried is a logical truth or not. Right? It's not. If you translate it into the predicate calculus, it doesn't come out as a formal logical truth. Right? But you might think that when we're talking about logic, we mean to include what people used to call analytic truths in it, right? So maybe that's a second difficulty. Perhaps one way of thinking about logical impossibility, the logical modality, is to think about what's knowable a priori. If you can know it a priori, then it's got to be a logical truth, right? If you can see a priori that something's false, then it's got to be a logical impossibility. There's some small, there are edge cases that are tricky for this account. For example, you might think that you know a priori that you exist by kind of Descartes' argument, but you're certainly not going to think that it's logically impossible that you don't exist. It was true in the past and it'll be true in the future, right? So there are some complexities there, but let's stick with what you know a priori. Then I think the metaphysical impossibilities are going to include all of those, but they're going to include some more things that you only know partly on the basis of experience, but that you nonetheless think are necessary or impossible. So in recent philosophy, I guess, most famously, Kripke argued that there are various cases of the necessary a posteriori. For example, it's necessary that water is 2 parts hydrogen to 1 part oxygen, but we sure didn't know that a priori, right? So that's considered to be a metaphysically necessary truth, but it's not a logically necessary truth. Things can't go in the other direction. So if something's logically necessary, it's got to be metaphysically necessary.
That's super helpful. Thank you so much. And now let's say if we define omnipotence as the ability to do all that is logically possible, does that avoid the paradoxes such as the stone paradox and other, or does even that definition carry philosophical difficulties?
So consider this. You can go to the gym and you can load up a machine so that you can't budget, right? You can definitely make something that it's too heavy for you to lift. So consider the property of being able to make something so heavy that you can't lift it. That's not a logically impossible property, right? But now ask whether God can make something so heavy that God can't lift it, and we have a puzzle. we have a puzzle to do with the notion of omnipotence. Because I can do it. If God can't do it, then it sounds as though God can't be omnipotent if God's supposed to be able to do everything that is logically possible to do, right? It's clearly logically possible for one to make something so heavy that one can't lift it. But it's not clear that we want to say that God can do that. Yeah.
Okay, so still problems. Okay, if God is omnipotent, do any other attributes logically follow from that? You mentioned something about omniscience, so can you tell us which attributes comes from that specific one, omnipotence? Yeah.
So I think that if you go with the ability to do formulation of omnipotence, so you can do anything that's logically possible to, I mean, maybe we'll go with that one, then pick any proposition, and ask the question, is it true that, and then put in the proposition. It's logically possible that you are able to answer it, right? It's logically possible for someone to answer it. So it's got to be that God is able to answer it. But if God can answer every question, then God's omniscient. There's no proposition that God doesn't know. So it's plausible that omniscience follows from omnipotence on that particular way of thinking about what omnipotence is. You might think that there are ways of defining these two terms where omniscience doesn't follow from omnipotence, but I'm not sure that I could think up an example that would make that plausible. So I think it's quite plausible omniscience follows from omnipotence. Does perfect goodness follow from omnipotence? That's much harder, right? There are people who think that and maybe this is kind of a little bit related to the kind of Thomistic perspective, that the divine attributes form a package, right? A very tightly connected package, so that you can't have perfect power without perfect goodness. The two have to go together. But if we think about power and goodness just with respect to people, you can be powerful and evil, right? So it doesn't seem like there's a conceptual connection between power and goodness, right? Whereas if we think about power and knowledge, and you think about the power as the ability to do things, and then you think about the ability to answer questions, it's not so clear that there isn't a connection there. On the other hand, if you think about power as just having control over things, then maybe you don't need lots of knowledge, you need some, right, in order to exercise control.
Yes, sorry for jumping in about this, but can we imagine people who can know something, but yeah, they have ability, but they simply don't know about it. So can we say also for God, if he is omnipotent, it's not necessary for him to be omniscient? Yeah.
So it's hard to see how you can be able to answer the question if you don't know the answer. Right? I'm thinking about it that way, that it's the way that you're currently set up. Give me a question, I'll give you the right answer. It seems like that's going to be omniscience, right? For every question you ask me, I'll give you the right answer. It feels like that's not going to be true of me unless I know everything. Right. Now, of course, you might think, well, okay, but maybe I've just got a really good smartphone. But and I'm going to look it up, but we can build into this that without consulting anyone else, I don't need any inputs in order to give you the answer.
Thank you, Professor Oppy. I asked Professor Alexander Prus about some arguments for omnipotence. So can we just think about this? He said a being with limited power couldn't be the first cause of every possible universe. So let's suppose that God exists and he is the cause of every possible universe. And he says, hence, wouldn't be the ultimate root cause of everything. Would you agree with this kind of thinking? Yes.
So suppose you think that the possible universes are just the universes that can be made by God. Right. So we're just going to hold that fixed. Right. We can certainly, well, you might think we can certainly dream up universes that if you didn't think that universes had to be made by God, they would seem to be possible, right? So what I'm thinking about here is the kind of thing that theists sometimes say, that there are lots of possible universes, but there's a cutoff point. Some universes are so bad that God can't make them. Right. Now, how are we going to make sense of that? Right. If we also say that every universe is made by God, it looks like the things that we thought were possible universes turn out to be impossible. Right. So there's something tricky going on here, right? It seems maybe there's some sort of equivocation between logically possible and metaphysically possible. If you think that the universes that God can make are the metaphysically possible ones, right? There are lots of what look like logically possible universes that God can't make because they're just so awful, right? Now, if that's right, then it's not so clear that you then have to think that God, that the fact that there's all these logically possible universes that God can't make isn't a kind of limitation. It's not so clear that it isn't a kind of limitation on God now, so that God isn't omnipotent in the able to do anything that is logically possible to do sense. So that's a kind of question that I think I'm not sure that I expressed it as clearly as I might have, but that's a question that I would want to ask Bruce, I think, given the argument as I understood it that you just gave.
Yes, I think I get it. So thank you. A really good answer. And what about his second part? He continues, a being with limited power has an arbitrary parameter specifying what that power is. This makes a more complex theory, plus arbitrary parameters in a necessary being are rather implausible. What do you think?
Okay, so going back to the example the scenario that I was just sketching, imagining that there's a cutoff. So God can make worlds that have a certain amount of evil in it, but then you reach a point where there's just a cutoff, and below that there's too much, the balance of evil over good is too high, and so God just can't possibly make those worlds. That looks like it'll be an arbitrary parameter, right? It's exactly what that cutoff is. And it certainly looks arbitrary from our standpoint, right? We definitely can't specify it. It feels like it's kind of unknowable to us how bad the world could be and yet be made by God. I mean, our world's got lots of horrible stuff in it, but we think that theists think that it's not so bad that God couldn't make it. So it's not clear that there isn't actually just an arbitrary parameter in Bruce's view, right? It depends a bit what you mean by arbitrary, right? It looks totally arbitrary from our standpoint, I think. Maybe you can insist that it's not.
Yes, it depends how you define that word. Yeah. Okay, so just curious, do you think are there any maybe better examples of paradoxes about omnipotence than stone paradox? That's a really common one, but do you have any other better example to your mind?
I mean, there's lots of variants of the stone paradox. So think of something as being a perfect solvent if it dissolves everything that's put in contact with it. And imagine that something's perfectly insoluble if there's nothing that when you put the thing into it, it dissolves. And now imagine that God can make a perfect solvent and a perfectly insoluble thing and put them together in the same world and join them together, right? There's endless variations like that, that you might. So it looks like, I mean, there's something that God can't do here. Either God can't make a perfect solvent, or he can't make a perfect insoluble substance, or he can't make a world where they come together, right? But it's weird if he can make these two things that he can't make a world where they come together. If you think about, the kind of patchwork principles for making worlds. You can make a world where there's an insoluble thing. You can make a world where there's a perfect solvent. You should be able to take them, patch them together in a world, and yet you can't, right? There's a kind of modal principle there that people like Bruce really like. That looks like it's a bit tricky in this case.
Wow, I like that one. So thank you so much for sharing. Now, let me ask about this. If God exists, is monotheism a more probable or coherent concept than polytheism? Does it have any greater explanatory power, etc.? So, any thoughts on that?
So I guess I'd ask the question the other way. I've maybe postulating more gods is an additional expense as opposed to postulating one. Do you get more explanatory power out of polytheism or not? Well, you might think that you do if you think that there are features of the world that are a bit hard to explain if there's just one perfect creator. Why are there in the biological realm such horrible things, right? Maybe that's because there was fighting between the gods, right? And there were. So I'll take a different example. Why is it that our eyes are so badly engineered? Why does the optic nerve come out of the front rather than out of the back, which is where any engineer would have put it, because we end up with a blind spot that we wouldn't have had? Well, if there was just one perfect designer, it's not going to make a rookie error like that. But if there's several, if there's a team of designers and they're arguing about all kinds of different things, they may have compromised on a design that none of them really liked, but it was the only one that they could get agreement on. And so we end up with the blind spot, right? So now appealing to a team as opposed to one maybe gives you an explanatory advantage in explaining some features of the world. You might think, right? So that's the kind of example that might make you think, okay, so it's more expensive to postulate more gods, but maybe it will buy you some explanatory power.
Amazing, yes, but we have Occam razor, so many people would say it's much simpler to have one than more. So
Yeah,
yeah,
but the way that Occam's razor works, you have as many as you need to get an adequate explanation, and so we're kind of trading off what we have a good explanation for against how many gods we're postulating. Maybe there's reasons why we'll be better off if we postulate a team of gods. Maybe. Right. I'm not saying this is a good argument. I'm just saying you asked me how might you argue it? Well, I think that's one way that you could try to do it.
yes, I wonder what do you think about this argument from convergence for monotheism? Some would say that all or most world religions and philosophies developed to monotheism through time. So that maybe points that there are some truth in that. So what do you think?
So I think it's true about Judaism that it was polytheistic and it became monotheistic. I think because it's monotheistic, there's, the fact that subsequent Abrahamic religions are monotheistic doesn't really require any further explanation. If you look at other religions, it's not so clear that they develop over time from polytheism to monotheism. So in Hinduism, I think it's not clear that, there are lots of people who'll say that sort of essentially Hinduism is monotheistic, but there are lots of people who disagree. There are lots of things in Hinduism that get called gods. People from the Abrahamic religions looking at Hinduism say things like, oh, maybe those things are demons and angels and stuff like that. But that's not I don't think that's the way that Hindus think about it, because they have devas and all kinds of other things as well as the gods. And they think of the gods as on a different level. And whether they think that Brahman or whatever lies in the background is really God is also unclear. So that similar things to say about Buddhism, rather different things to say about Chinese religions, where monotheism never really seemed to develop on its own. So I'm not sure that there's a good argument, really, about the march of progress towards monotheism. It's true that there are lots that over time you get more monotheists, but I think that has much more to do with who wins the wars, right? Which cultures become dominant, rather than any kind of, even if we'd left them on their own, they would have developed to monotheism.
Yes, really interesting. Thank you so much. And let's continue with other attributes. If we, of course, accept that God exists, do you think it is more coherent to conceive of God as being in time or outside of the time or timeless? So perhaps there are some people that would say both. He's in and outside of time simultaneously. So that's a mystery.
But there are also people who say both. So William Lane Craig says God's timeless before creation and in time afterwards, right? So that you say, so in a way you say both, right? But not, it's not that you're contradicting yourself, that you're saying God's in time and God's out of time, say prior to creation or post-creation. It's just that there's a different status. There are questions about are hard questions in the philosophy of time about whether you can make sense of there being anything outside of time, I think. But there's a kind of pressure. If you think that there's a God and you think that God's always in time, then it looks as though you're going to have an infinite past, right? Because it's not like there's going to be a first moment of time if God's always in time. So Craig faces this kind of interesting question about when he says that God's not in time, so there's a kind of eternity, right? Is there any structure to eternity, right? Is there any kind of before or after in the eternal realm? And you might think that that there's a kind of causal before and after, that God's thinking and making decisions and so on, right, sequentially up to the point where God creates. But in that case, you end up with a kind of absolute beginning for God. And the Kalam argument is a kind of argument that if something's got a beginning, it's got a cause. And so there's a kind of worry about self-undermining happening if you've got this kind of view, right? The kind of view that unless you want to say, which is, I think, the way that Boethius thinks about eternity, there's no before and after in eternity. It's like, but he also says that it's endless, right? Whereas the no before or after makes it sound like it's a point, right? And the notion of an endless point is kind of tricky, right? So I think there are definitely difficulties in thinking about the relationship between God and time, because there are just these difficulties in thinking about time. Right? Does time have a beginning? Right? Even if you think that somehow time and space are inextricably linked, you might think that our universe is part of a bigger space, and there's a space and time that, there's a history in this bigger space that just goes back infinitely far. If you have a certain kind of multiverse view, that's just what you will think, right? And that also complicates the discussion. I don't know, I hope that's enough.
Great thoughts. Thank you. And besides the timelessness, we have other attributes that are connected with idea Neoclassical Theism. So if that's correct, God is not timeless. He is also not immutable. We would negate also simplicity, impossibility. So what do you think about those other three that I mentioned: immutability, simplicity, and impossibility? Is that more coherent than classical theism, or what do you think?
Right, so this is difficult. I just think these views are very different, right? So there's a kind of question. To take Aquinas as an example, there's a question about how God knows what we do, assuming that we have freedom. Right? As I understand it from talking to some of my Catholic friends who are philosophers, the way that God knows what you freely do is because God is the cause, but not that God's responsible for what you do, right? But somehow or other, God knows through God's act of creation what you freely do, right? Because what we're trying to avoid is having information traveling back from your action to God, because that would undermine the impassibility, right? What I actually think, so this is what some of my friends think, is that actually Aquinas didn't really think that we had freedom, right? Aquinas was a kind of determinist, right? That's not the orthodox view, but there's definitely a challenge here to reconcile impassibility and God's knowledge of what we freely do, right? If we really have freedom so that it's entirely up to us what we do.
Yes, and others. What about simplicity?
So I mentioned this at the beginning. So there are people like Plantinga had this book, Does God Have a Nature, in which he just ridicules the idea of simplicity. I'm not inclined to join Plantinga. I think that there may be ways that you can use stuff from contemporary metaphysics to make sense of simplicity. So there's an idea I had back in the late 90s was that you could use truth maker theory, and you could insist that what makes it true that God's omniscient is God. So God's the truth maker. What makes it true that God's omnipotent is God. So God's the truth maker. In fact, God's the truth maker for a whole range of things. And there are people who defended this kind of line about truth making at the time. And subsequently, in the 2000s, there are a bunch of theists like Jeff Brouwer, or Brewer, I don't know how you pronounce his name, I think it's Brouwer, who had a similar kind of thought. So it seems to me that it's not impossible that you can run something that looks a lot like divine simplicity using techniques from analytic philosophy, and that you end up with something that's coherent. So that was what I argued in my long ago paper, was that this was a kind of coherent model for simplicity.
All right, Professor Oppy, but if God exists and if you must choose one of those two options between neoclassical and classical theism, which one is better concept?
Okay, so I'm going to go back to what I said at the beginning. It is kind of Weasley, but I don't want to choose between them, right? I can just, I mean, neither of them is my view, right? And if I mean, I don't think, I think that there couldn't be any gods. I think that there couldn't be a God. So from my point of view, you're asking me to choose between options that I just think are impossibilities. But if I'm thinking about what it's reasonable for people to believe, and I think about the people I know and the kinds of things that I say, you can reasonably believe either of them, right? So it's...
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. If God is in time, do succession and change undermine his perfection and the fullness of his being? What do you think about that?
So if you think of the divine perfection as being as good as it's possible to be at all points, so you think, then if you're an open theist and you think that God's in time, and you think that God learns things over time, you might think that's sort of consistent with what God knows at any point in time. God's as good as it's possible for anyone to be, consistent with the ignorance and the lack of power and so on. Right. So and you might think that if we're talking about perfection, what we should be thinking about is just being as good as it's possible to be. That's perfection, right? So it turns out that you can still think that God's perfect. Now, you might have this notion, but what if you'd known more? Right, it's impossible, but supposing per impossible you'd known more, then you could have been better. And to which I think the right answer is, yeah, but that's impossible too, right? Given that you couldn't know more, you couldn't be better, right? So it's not clear that thinking that God learns, which is the kind of the central idea in open theism, I think, the idea that God learns doesn't mean that God isn't perfect, right? As good as it's possible to be.
All right, thank you again. And now let's talk more about omniscience. At the beginning, you mentioned something about free will. So there are a lot of theories of providence, of foreknowledge, and open theism, Molinism. So what do you think about that? If there is no any knowledge about future, like open theism would say?
Um, yeah, interesting. There's so much to say about this topic. So I'll start with something about Molinism. So the idea is that prior to creation, God has certain kinds of knowledge, right? So he has, and in particular, amongst the three kinds of knowledge there's middle knowledge, which is knowledge about what agents would freely do were they placed in particular positions. So God has this knowledge about what people will do. So if pretend to be God for a minute, if I make this world, I know that this person will do this in these circumstances. And if I make this world, I know that that person will do that in these circumstances. In fact, for everybody in all the circumstances, I know what they're going to do. And then I pick a world, right? And so my picking the world is causally upstream from the actions, right? And so now the question is, in what's part of the circumstance of the actions? If part of the circumstance of the actions is that way back there, God picked this world partly because I'm going to do this in these circumstances, then clearly there's nothing else I can do given the circumstances, right? Because when God created, God knew what I was going to do. It's fixed. There's no alternative in the circumstances. Of course, if you drop God out of the picture, right, and you just think about me and the circumstances, you can imagine me, and you don't think of God's creative action as part of the circumstances, you can imagine me doing different things, right? But it turns out, I think, on the Molinist picture, that you don't have libertarian freedom. You couldn't have done otherwise because of what's causally upstream. Right? So you might think that's just a problem that's caused by the idea that God's got middle knowledge, right? So you can imagine a different kind of God who rolls the dice. God doesn't know what you're going to do, right? There's a range of things. God picks a starting point so that things can't get too bad, right? And then just lets it run. Well, now there's no interference with your freedom. It's true that God made this world, but he didn't make the world knowing what you were going to do. There's enough indeterminism, there's enough freedom in the world that God doesn't know. So this is more the open theistic picture now, right? Now there's no problem about human freedom.
Yes, recently there was one podcast with Dr. Craig. So he was asked this question: how can God be omniscient and yet not know what it's like to sin? So there are similar questions like this, but how would you answer on those?
So one thing to distinguish is between propositional knowledge and non-propositional knowledge. So I'm thinking knowing that, and then you fill in the blank, right? Now, you might think of omniscience as just being defined with respect to propositional knowledge alone. And then it doesn't require that God knows how to ride a bike or that God knows what it's like to taste Vegemite, because those are non-propositional, right? It's a bit hard to, right? I mean, God's not the kind of thing that can ride a bike. So it's not clear that it really makes sense to say God knows how to ride a bike, right? But that's not, there's no proposition there, right? Similarly, God's not the kind of thing that can eat Vegemite. So presumably God doesn't know what it's like to taste Vegemite. Now, you could deny both of these. You could say, nonetheless, God knows how to ride a bike. God knows what Vegemite tastes like. But you don't have to say that. You can just say omniscience is about propositional knowledge, and then there's not going to be a difficulty, right? And you can say the thing I said, God's not the kind of thing that could know how to ride a bike or what Vegemite tastes like, but those are not limitations on God. It's not like those are imperfections in God. Because it's because of what God is that God can't do those things. Only kind of imperfect beings like us can know what it's like to taste Vegemite or ride a bike.
Yeah, so really good points. Thank you. Let's talk about now moral properties of God. If we say God is omnibenevolent and also omnipotent, can he be like that if we see all the evil that we observe in the world? So, are there some incoherence about that?
Right. So this is a vast topic. What to say about what's called the problem of evil is, it's enormous. One thing that you might say is that once you assume that God's omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, you're very limited in the predictions that you can make about what kind of world God would make. The reason being that the gulf between you and God with respect to knowledge and power and goodness is so enormous. Right? So it seems to lots of us that if there were an omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good God, God wouldn't make a world in which the Holocaust happened. God just couldn't do that because of the amount of suffering that was involved. But we're not privy to all of the considerations. That we know nothing about world making. We're not privy to the relevant considerations. We shouldn't suppose that we're capable of making that assessment. Right. So this is what's called the skeptical theist approach to the problem of evil. And it's always seemed to me that there's something to this approach. I mean, there are kind of worries about it, but it doesn't seem incredible that you might think, because of what we're imagining about God's attributes and how they compare to ours, that we're not going to be well placed to work out what God would do, even though God's perfect with respect to goodness and the world is full of imperfection. Okay, so there's one kind of response. Here's a very different kind of response that I make sometimes. There's a serious puzzle. If we think that God's perfect, how can it be that God makes something that's imperfect? Right? Because things must get worse, right? We had perfection and now we've departed from it, and nobody disputes that imperfection isn't as good as perfection. So it's a total mystery how it could even make sense to think that there's a perfect creator of an imperfect world. Now, you can see that that argument must be implicitly making some assumptions about the insights that we could have into what a perfect being would do. But I still kind of feel the grip of this, the intuitive pull of this argument, right? That there's something very strange about the idea that there's a point where everything's perfect, and then there's a point where it isn't, right? And somehow or other, the perfect thing is responsible for producing the imperfection. But how could that be? Right? Perfection surely can't give rise to imperfection. Anyway, so there's a different take on the question about evil.
Yes, so if we choose skeptical theism, we can ask ourselves, okay, maybe God is lying, but we don't know what is the reason why he's lying us, or why he's evil or anything else. So we have range of other options to doubt.
Right, but the skeptical theist doesn't need to doubt that God's perfectly good. I know maybe it's a kind of article of faith, but supposing that God is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good, we just can't predict what's going to come out, because our knowledge and our power and our goodness is so limited. Right. This is a bit of a cousin, maybe, of the view that really, when we're talking about the goodness of God or the power of God or the knowledge of God, we're only talking analogically. We really don't have a proper conception of what we're talking about. I expect that most skeptical theists wouldn't want to draw that connection, but possibly there is a connection there.
Yes, that's a good answer. But we can doubt on other things, maybe about our reason, on a logic, or yeah. So maybe not about his goodness, but yeah, other things. So what do you think about that?
So I think we've already discussed that. I mean, I think that's right. We might think that we're just not very well equipped to think about God, because there's so much we don't know, because of our infirmities, also because of the fact that there's so much evidence that our rationality is very imperfect.
Okay, thank you, Professor Oppy. Now, what about spaceless attribute? Does it even make sense to say that the God is outside of space?
So this is one thing I hinted at before. If you think of space and time as a package, so that you know, there's a manifold and time's a dimension, and then there are several spatial dimensions, and nobody's exactly sure how many perhaps, but there's at least three. If you've got that view, then talking about a time before doesn't really make sense, right? Because if time's essentially just a dimension in a manifold that's got spatial dimensions, it's going to be thinking about something existing before time. Sounds problematic, but it certainly will follow that it's going to be not in space either. If you've got that indissolubility of space and time, the thing that exists outside will be both timeless and spaceless. However, you might think that you can have a kind of nesting, right? So this is a kind of many universe view. There's our space and time, which belongs to our particular manifold, but then there are other universes that have their own spaces and times, and they're not coordinated to one another. So if you imagine another universe in the multiverse, and you ask what's happening now, there's no answer to that question. The time scales are just independent of one another. You could have that kind of view, and then maybe we can bring back in the idea that it's not that God's timeless and spaceless, it's just that God's in another time and another space. If you're worried about the idea of timelessness and spacelessness. On the other hand, you might think, so this is a thought that I've pursued on and off for at least 25 years. You might think that somehow or other, time and space are not primitive. What's really primitive is causation, and there are causal relations between things, and time and space are constructed out of the causal relations between things. And you might think that you need a sufficiently rich causal structure in order to get space and time. And if the causal structure is not rich enough, you just have causation. And so now we can have God causing things, and then at a certain point, there's enough complexity in the causal relations between the things that have been caused to get you space and time, right? Now that's a picture on which God's not in space, not in time, but God is a cause. So that depends on substantive assumptions about the relationship between causation and the relationship between time and space. And it's not an awfully popular view that causation is more fundamental in space and time, but if you are willing to go that way, then it's going to be harder to say there's something problematic about the idea that you've got a spaceless, timeless God that causes space-time.
Awesome, Dr. Oppy. My next question is on necessary existence. If God exists, is he then a necessary being? If so, how can then be, if it's not logically contradictory for him to not exist? If he is not necessary, how should we understand that? Craig answered that there is distinction between broad and strict logical possibilities. So do you see those two distinctions or not?
So we drew a distinction back at the beginning of the conversation between logical modality and metaphysical modality that may or may not map onto exactly what Craig had in mind when he was talking about strict and broad, but it will do. So long as you're prepared to draw a distinction like that, you can claim that, yes, we don't know a priori that God exists. I mean, there are people who run ontological arguments who think that we do, but Craig's not a fan of ontological arguments, right? We don't know a priori that God exists, but we know on the basis of experience that not only that God exists, but that God exists necessarily. So it's necessary a posteriori that God exists. That seems like it will solve those worries if you say something like that.
Yes, fair enough. Okay, Dr. Oppy, I just want to know, what is your view on Trinity? If we define the Trinity as three divine persons that are part of one God, does that help avoid contradictions about that concept?
Okay, so this is a hard question, right? And I don't have a favorite model of the Trinity. I don't have a preferred view about whether in the end it really makes sense or not, right? I mean, there are traditions, Islamic tradition, Jewish tradition, which are quite happy to argue that this just doesn't make sense. I mean, they certainly think it's impossible, but they'll go further than that and say that it's just nonsensical. I've supervised projects by students trying to make sense of the Trinity. I think it is a very difficult task myself, but clearly there are lots of people who do think that it makes sense, and there are some well-developed theories. It's very hard to think about, in part because there are so many constraints that are put on the theorizing. So the idea is that there are two heresies that you have to avoid. You have to avoid saying that there are three gods, and you have to avoid saying that there are just three modes of a single God. And hitting a sweet spot in between those two is not easy. I'll say that.
Okay, Dr. Oppy, my last question about those attributes, and we are heading to the end. So, do you think that if God exists, it is likely that he have a worship worthiness attribute? He demands something like that to worship him, and what do you think on that?
So I've been influenced in thinking about this by what Sobel said in his book on logic and theism. And he thought that it couldn't be that there was something that intrinsically demanded worship. He just thought that that was an impossibility, incoherent idea. And clearly there are a range of meta-ethical views you can take that are going to have this consequence. And I think that John Mackey probably, I mean, given that Mackey was an error theorist about moral attributes, I don't think that he thought that it could possibly be that there was a being that was intrinsically worthy of worship, right? And presumably to be intrinsically worthy of worship, it's not enough that you're very powerful, right? Even that you're perfectly powerful, right? It's got to have to do with goodness. It's got to be part of the package that you're perfectly good. And Mackey thought that that didn't make sense, right? The notion of perfect goodness didn't make sense. So there's a range of ways of going on which you'll think it's metaphysically impossible that there's a being that's worthy of worship. But again, the question is going to be, is it a priori obnoxious, right? Is it logically impossible? Is there something irrational in believing that God's intrinsically worthy of worship? And on that question, I'm quite happy to just say, knock yourselves out if you think it will. It's not like I can show you that there's a contradiction, a logical contradiction, a contradiction in predicate calculus that follows from your thinking that.
Very good answer. Thank you, Dr. Oppy. And consider everything that we have covered. What do you think on comment of Richard Swinburne? He would argue many times that God is the simplest explanation, but considering all these problems and paradoxes, is he really the simplest explanation or not?
So if you mean the simplest explanation for the universe, the existence and nature of the universe and everything that happens in its history and so on, I disagree with Swinburne that God's the simplest explanation. I think that a better theory just supposes that the universe is all that there is, right? I think when you do the accounting, that turns out to be a better view than a view that adds in God. But that's controversial, right? Swinburne certainly doesn't agree, and there's a whole lot of points because Swinburne thinks there's a lot of data points. He thinks that, for example, you get a better explanation of why there's something rather than nothing if you postulate God. You get a better explanation of the apparent fine-tuning of various things if you think there's a God than if you don't. And you get a better explanation of why there's consciousness if you think there's a God than if you don't, and so on. Of course, a whole range of things. And I disagree with his judgments in every case, right? I don't think that I don't accept Swinburne's account of the simplicity of God. That is, that the hypothesis that God exists is a very simple hypothesis. Even the people who say that God's simple, right, in a different sense, though we're not talking about the hypothesis, but we're talking about God, generally admit that the theory of the simple God is highly complicated. If you go and look at accounts of divine simplicity, they fill very large books, right? So there's something about the theory that's complicated, even if the God turns out to be simple, right? So Christopher Hughes wrote a book called A Complex Theory of a Simple God or something like that. which in part kind of makes this point. I don't think that Swinburne's theory of God is particularly simple. It's certainly not negligible, right? And by my lights, it's all cost, right? It doesn't help you to explain anything about the universe. It doesn't improve the explanations of anything about the universe. So in my view, now, is it comparatively simple, the theory of God that Swinburne has? But that depends, right? There's an awful lot. If you read his books about the resurrection and the atonement and miracles, and his book on the coherence of theism, it turns out that there's an awful lot of theory in there and an awful lot of stuff that isn't just entailed by the formula that God's omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly good, creator of all else, or something like that, whatever exactly the formula is. There's a lot more to the theory than
Okay, Dr. Oppy, at the conclusion, can you say any words about all this that we covered? And also, what would you say to people that are something like fideists that want to believe in God from experience, but they see all those problems that you mentioned, and what they should do, according to your opinion, how to deal with those paradoxes?
I think that people who are fideists, or if they genuinely are, don't really have a problem. It's what they should do is just not worry about the philosophical questions. What they can do is, if you go around and you talk to philosophers, you'll get diverse perspectives on every single thing that we've talked about. Is there really a serious problem about omnipotence? Is there really a serious problem about omniscience? And so on through all of them. If you're a fideist, I think you say, the discussion's all completely inconclusive. I'm not going to worry about it. If, on the other hand, you've got bitten by the philosophy bug and you can't help worrying about these things, you're probably not going to be a fideist. Right? But you still might think, as all Christian philosophers do, that in the end you've got answers to all of the worries, or at least you've got enough by way of answers that your kind of faith can make up the rest of the gap.
Okay, Professor Oppy, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your insight on the coherence of theism. Your clarity, depth, and intellectual honesty are truly appreciated. So to our listeners, thank you for watching or listening. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the NT podcast for more thought-provoking discussions at the intersection of science, theology, and philosophy. Until next time, stay curious and keep thinking deeply. Goodbye.